From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. The political story of Singapore's industrialization is well known, including the role of Jurong Industrial Estate and Dr. Kah Swee. However, the stories of the Singaporeans who worked in these factories have rarely been discussed in detail until now. Today, we speak to Dr. Loh Kah Seng, co-author of the book Theatres of Memory: Industrial Heritage of 20th Century Singapore, on who worked in Singapore's early factories, what the workplace environment was like, and the important role of technical education in creating a qualified workforce. Thanks very much, Dr. Loh, for joining me today. To start off, what prompted you to explore Singapore industrial history and why is it important for us to learn about it?
Thanks, Dave. It's great to be back on your podcast again. I was always interested in labor history, so that probably helped move the project towards that social labor history angle, which was also very much prompted by reading Raphael Samuel's book, Theatres of Memories, where although he talked about different kinds of memory, industrial memories, and how industrial memories have been created and sustained in the British context, in museums, in communities, as to, of course, it's important, and the book is to a large extent about the workers as much as about the industries. And the early workers in the 60s, especially, who started to move into the factory work after their graduation from school, they were really the pioneers of Singapore. And we've often talked about this pioneer generation, Merdeka generation, without really getting into the texture of their work and their working lives and how this was very much connected with their families that they were building at the time. So it's important on an academic level, but also important as well on a social level that, we go beyond these cliches and broad strokes to really know what pioneerhood means, for these groups of people. I mean, this was a remarkable generation in a sense that they were the first cohort who stepped en masse into factories. And factory work is quite unlike the character of Singapore's labor history before the Second World War, especially before the industrialization program. Most of the work in Singapore was seasonal, casual, unless you were fortunate enough to work, you had the language, you had the skills to work in a white-collar profession. Otherwise, the work was manual, the work was seasonal, part-time. There was a lot of underemployment. So when industries came to Singapore and you have the advent of full-time employment, I mean, that was a historic moment. Not just because now you have full wages and, regular pay that allow you to buy HDB flats and all that, but also it required a different mindset of working. You are no longer, you work a few months and then you stop, or you work half the day and then you stop, like, for example, the hawkers would do, right? So this required a new kind of perspective, discipline as well. So there was a lot of factory discipline that was new to these workers, and the struggles to coming to terms with this discipline. And many of these workers were women in the factories, and they had to come under the discipline from the men who were the supervisors, leaders. So some of the women succeeded and became, even promoted to leaders of these lines, these groups. But even for the sort of the production workers in general, they were able to come to terms with the regimental assembly line culture by making friends, actually.
So let's start from the beginning of the story. What was the status of Singapore's industries before the PAP's industrialization projects began from 1960?
Yeah, so the main thing you see there is that these are the PAP, the government's industrialization. It might seem a bit strange why you needed the government to go into industry or to promote industrialization when these are things that are normally associated with businessmen and industrialists. So, of course, in Singapore's history, before the 1960s, before the 1950s, actually, when the British had started to promote industrialization on a small scale, we were an island, a colony of merchants, and there were a number of light industries in Singapore. There were no heavy industries in Singapore. There was no such thing as the shipbuilding and repair industries that we had after the 60s. Before the 60s, for example, the naval dockyard at the naval base was only meant to service a small number of naval craft, warships that were docked or passing through the naval base. So there was no industrial sector for heavy industry. The existing industries in Singapore before the war were mostly light industries. There were outgrowth of the entrepot trade that Singapore was part of. That was the mainstay of Singapore's economy. And these light industries, such as pineapples, pepper, I shouldn't say pepper, pineapple canning, rubber shoes, other rubber products, were being manufactured in Singapore because the businessmen who were in the primary industries wanted to diversify their business so as to spread the risk. This is always something they had done historically. And, the more enterprising ones will have seen that there was some profit there to be made. So these were very much fledgling industries before the war, and you find that the British government did not encourage them. In fact, the British thought that, things like textiles would be a threat, to home manufacturers in Britain. So there was a big change after the war, especially under the PAP government, where you find, the idea that, of a welfare state, of a socialist state, that the government should push these kinds of programs, economic development and social welfare services and wealth distribution policies. That was very indicative of that Fabian socialist mindset of the West, especially Britain, after the war.
How crucial were foreign institutions and experts such as Dr. Albert Winsemius to helping Singapore industrialize during these early years?
Very much so, And again, like the industrialization programs that were led by the government, that were promoted by the government, these foreign institutions and experts were part of a global trend after the Second World War, with the defeat of the fascists and Nazi states. You find that there was now a new emphasis on things like international cooperation, technical cooperation, to move away from ideologies and politics and aggressive competition between nation states. So, of course, the best example of this is the formation of the United Nations after the war. And many of the institutions and experts that assisted Singapore's economic, industrial development were from these groups of people. So Albert Winsemius, he's Dutch. He was Dutch, and he came on a UNDP program that was supposed to give Singapore advice about how to industrialize. So this was a period of globalization that was happening alongside the increasing popularity of the expansion of the state, in the West after the Second World War. So you have, on the one hand, these expanding states which are now involved in a lot more services and economic plans, and you have these institutions that are advising these states, how to efficiently and effectively carry out these plans. Of course, the other factor in this global arena was the Cold War, and the UN, all these experts did not simply preach what they believed to be the best strategy for economic development, but they preached the best capitalist one, right? So this was capitalism that was promoted by the state, and to some extent mixed with a socialist impulse, a democratic socialist impulse in places like Singapore and other former colonies, so that these new states would stay away from the Marxist Soviet path to development. So that's a very interesting part, and Singapore's industrial story is very much part of this bigger global history of economic development that was facilitated and mediated through these technical industrial experts and advisors. I should say we haven't really fully uncovered all the experts that came to Singapore in the various industries. I mean, some of these experts went to things like education, it's not even industry, social services. Pretty much every department of government had some experts advising them. It is not on that national strategic scale, it's on a more kind of grounds level work and development in the education sector, in the welfare services sector. So this was a time when Singaporeans were also getting to know and to speak to and work with many of these foreigners who were coming to Singapore.
You call the flatted factory the pillar of Singapore's light industries. Could you share with us why this type of building was so important to us?
Yeah, these flatted factories, of course, are still with us today, and they will continue to be with us as long as HDB flats are with us today as the primary form of housing. So flatted factories, very much think about them as the sister of the HDB blocks, and they were very much symbiotic. They coexisted together. That was always the intention. New towns were always planned not just as residential areas, but as kind of total holistic areas of where accommodation, work, social services, public services, commerce come together. And flatted factories were always part of the plans for Singapore's development. The target of the flatted factories was specifically the young women, mostly in the beginning of limited education, who would be considered, the best people to work in these flatted factories. So there's a bit of racism here, I would say, if you are looking at the employment of these young women from the perspective of the MNCs, the multinationals, especially the Western MNCs that came to Singapore to establish electronics, semiconductors, textiles, and other kinds of mass assembly industries that do not require a lot of skill, but require nimble fingers and good eyes. So the women were seen to be suitable for this because they had nimble fingers, and also because they were easy to manage. They felt that they were easy to manage compared to the men. They were cheap because they were not highly skilled. Skill was not required also. So these flatted factories were placed near the HDB flats, sometimes the kampongs, but the kampongs were increasingly cleared throughout the 60s and 70s. So you find that, the women could easily walk to home, and it was convenient for them to work there without much transport. So if you come a few decades later, the 80s onwards, you find that the flatted factories also serve the function of trying to attract women who were not economically active. And this, in the government's mind, became a problem after 1970, where for the previous 25 years, the main concern was with creation of jobs. In 1970, they found that now jobs were not the problem. Now the labor, the manpower was the problem. So Singapore experienced a labor shortage and began to recruit workers from Malaysia, and about 8 years later, workers from other Asian countries. But there was never something that the government was comfortable with. The government was concerned about the social tensions that might arise from having too many foreign workers, or the instability that could be caused as a result of having foreigners who were very different from locals. So that was always the emphasis, let's try to get the Singaporean women who are not economically active to work in the factories, in particular the flatted factories, which were housing the light industries. These women were not economically active, often because they were married, they had children, and they resigned from their jobs to take care of the children. So the flatted factory was a way to try to encourage them to go out to work again. So alongside the flatted factories, you have the creches, which were very important as well. so that the children could be taken care of during the working hours. So there was a kind of tug of war, at the minds and hearts of these women factory workers, and it was very much a struggle. I wouldn't say that the flatter factory was completely successful. You'll find that over time, many of these employees in the flatter factories were foreigners, right? Like for example, Malaysians, subsequently from other countries, because for the economically inactive housewives, it was a real challenge for them to work while bringing up their children, while wanting to take care of their families. And also while there was still this societal pressure, right, that the women should be the homemakers while the men would work. So that still persisted. So that makes the flatter factory very much an important site of the social dynamics behind Singapore's industrialization program.
Who was the typical Singaporean factory worker from the 1960s to 1980s, and why was the night shift so important to many of them?
So some of it I've touched on in the previous question. One thing to add is that the typical Singaporean factory worker was female, very young. Many of them had just freshly graduated from school, so they would be just above 16 or 18. There were probably a minority that was even younger, who lied about their age to get in. Ethnically, they belong to all the ethnic groups, so not just Chinese, but you find that Malays, Indians, and others were actually very interested to get work in the factories. And the reason for this was the stability of an income, the existence of a regular income. That was what they wanted. So there's a connection between the different chapters in the book. There is that chapter which maps out the demographic characteristics of these factory workers. And then there is another chapter which is on the rise of a consumerist culture in Singapore. Why did they want a regular income? It's so that they could purchase all these fashions and, clothing, lifestyles, food and beverages associated with modernity. What was regarded as a modern lifestyle in the 70s and 80s. So the popular drinks became the carbonated drinks. Jeans came in. Brands came in as well. Branded clothing became desirable. So the one thing that came out from the oral history was, how much an object of desire was this thing called a stable income. An income that you could get every month. So it's not simply something that you can get from part-time work or casual work, which is a intermittent kind of income. A regular income you could rely on. And of course, the biggest item of consumption was the HDB flat, right? So when the worker gets married, then they and their spouses would purchase a HDB flat, which was only possible if you had a regular CPF contributions. So that was very much tied into the desire of the factory workers, the motivations of the factory workers. Now, the thing about the night shift was also related to what I spoke about earlier, that there was always this difficulty, right? This dilemma about how to raise the family and work at the same time. So the night shift was not the night shift was very common in Singapore. There were different forms of night shift. There were different forms of shifts. There were also different forms of night shift. So you had the permanent one, or you had the one that was rotated, every few weeks. So the permanent night shift was perhaps the most demanding one, because that pretty much commits you to working at night, 11 to 7, for the entirety of your employment. It was not easy to do so, but some remarkable women did decide to do this because that was a way for them to manage their home and their work demands. Right? So they would sleep in the day, They would do the things that they had to do for the children, for the family, such as cooking, making the meals, so before or after the shift. Right? So in a sense that they were centering the night shift as the mainstay of their lives, of their daily lives, and moving the family tasks, chores, childcare to accommodate the introduction of the night shift. It was tiring for many of them. It was really tiring for many of them. But I have also had women tell me that they loved it. It was quiet at night. It's not like the day shift. There was less supervision, and they managed to reconcile between the two demands of home and work. So this was a remarkable part of the labor history of Singapore. And one of the big themes in my book was always to acknowledge the voices and the memories of the workers. That's why the title is Theatres of Memory, which actually comes from Raphael Samuel. And you find that it's not just these women who remembered this night shift so vividly, but also their children, right? Because where they remember when their mothers left the house for work, right? Or why they had to have certain kinds of routines, why they left the house, why they came back to the house and did certain things at certain times. So the memories of the night shift are very strong, and that was an important thing that you can find out from the oral history interviews and memories.
You devote a chapter to the West German camera manufacturer Rollei, which had a factory in Singapore from 1971 to 1981. What does oral history tell us about this spectacle of industry?
Yeah, Rollei was just one of the many MNCs that came to Singapore, and probably not the most successful one because he went bankrupt after a decade. There were others I could have focused on, but this was really by chance. I think I made a post on Facebook on Rollei, and I found out the camera, the Rollei 35 camera, was such an item of memory amongst older Singaporeans. And also this was a new one. This was an early industry that was beginning to shift the focus from labor-intensive assembly work to more sophisticated technical crafts. It's not just using your hands to put things together, which you don't even understand, but Singapore was beginning to shift towards things like precision mechanics and precision engineering. And Rollei was one of the early ones. Rollei did not spark that move to the higher level economy, which only happened in 1979. But that was because a few years after Rollei came, we had that global oil crisis that made the government worried, pull back on this economic reform. Because if you wanted to move from labor to capital intensive economy, you had to raise wages, and pretty much the government felt that in an economic crisis, it's not timely to raise wages. Rollei was an early indicator that this kind of economic restructuring was on the government's mind as early as 1970. Right. So in the book, I talk about this spectacle of industry and how Rollei was a spectacle. It was a spectacle in one sense that it was always hailed as a big achievement by the government and by the media, that we had succeeded. Rollei had not originally wanted to come to Singapore, but we had persuaded them, the EDB had persuaded them to do so. That was hailed as a great accomplishment, a big coup. But through the oral history interviews I did, through the research on social media, engaging with people who remembered Rollei and had worked in Rollei, I found that there was another spectacle of industry, and that goes back to the things that I talked about earlier, that the factory floor, right, where the women were making the various parts of the camera or other optical equipment. That was a spectacle in itself that few people outside Rollei could see, but was a spectacle nonetheless. So you had all these young, impressionable girls who had been recruited to work on the factory floor, and they were becoming a real challenge for the supervisors. The supervisors were Singaporeans who were sent to learn production line for various parts of this optical equipment in Germany, right? So they pretty much embraced and breathed inhaled the culture of production in Germany, which was very oriented towards punctuality and industrial discipline. And then they came back to Singapore, set up the production lines, and they found that the Singaporean women were nothing like the Germans who were used to that social discipline. And so it was very interesting, really, to find that there was such a difference in opinion about the production lines from the male technicians, the supervisors, and the female production workers. So again, you find that the men complaining that these girls were so difficult to manage. They will be talking all the time, and you cannot stop them from talking because they were concerned with productivity, right? That was one of the things that they had learned in Germany. And on the other hand, the girls were talking to each other while working. So this was felt to affect their productivity. So what I found was that actually this culture of work was actually very important to help the girls settle in and enable them to sustain their work in Rolai and also more generally in industry, because the work was very mundane. This was assembly work. So you are doing the same task over and over again. I mean, there is no way for the Singaporean women at the time, now it might be different, but at the time, they were not used to having this social discipline imposed on them. So the only thing they could do then was to speak to one another, chat. So nothing too distracting, but they would, joke with one another and have informal casual chats while they were working. So I believe that in the course of time, these women managed to be both productive and find a level of interest to sustain their work in the industry. In fact, one of the women I interviewed from Rolai, she admitted that she was one of those naughty girls, right? She admitted that she used the term naughty girls, and she was disciplined, and in fact, I think she was demoted. But then after a few years, she had a child, and then she became more serious in her work, and she was promoted to a line leader. And that shows that the women were not simply recalcitrant or difficult like the men thought, but they had a sense of their own motivation, and they needed time to adjust to the circumstances. I mean, there are also two things I should say about this. One was that this kind of gossip and chat among the women was also a form of social capital. It was a way for them to build a kind of solidarity on the shop floor without having to go to the unions, so that this gave them some social capital when they had to raise issues with the management. So I would imagine that some of this gossip would be about certain difficult or problematic supervisors, right? And this kind of gets the word out, and it's a way to temper the pressure put on by these difficult supervisors. The other thing I wanted to say. Yeah, so to really get down to the shop floor and to understand the dynamics going on there, I mean, that was very interesting for me, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without the social history.
The history of industrialization also runs parallel to the history of technical education. What were Singapore's challenges here?
Yeah, so even in the colonial history of Singapore before the war, technical education was never regarded very strongly. I mean, why would you need technical education if you're not going to promote manufacturing on a large scale? And the British were not going to do that. When there was education, especially higher level education, tertiary education, it was almost always academic education. So you find that the families and the people who value education before the war tended to value academic education. So obviously this became a problem when the industrialization program was launched. You had to break this emphasis on technical education. One of the best examples here is the history of the Singapore Polytechnic, actually. So the Polytechnic was formed in the last years of not the last years, but the last years when education was under the British government, before the PAP government was formed. And it was a very modest effort to promote higher level technical education, to produce technicians and engineers. It had a very small cohort, and it did not include students who were not good in English. So it was still very much biased towards English. So the students that he was thinking of recruiting were students who had come from English schools or with their working adults with a fairly good command of English. So this means that those who were educated in the vernacular schools, which was the case in Singapore in that time, Tamil schools or Chinese schools, would not qualify for the Polytechnic. So this changed in 1959 when Singapore attained self-government and Toh Chin Chai became the Chancellor of the Singapore Polytechnic. So he totally destroyed the old system at the Polytechnic, called it a bunch of names, and pretty much restructured the Polytechnic so that it would support the national development and industrialization programs. So that was to get more of the people focused on technical education. Like, for example, in the colonial period, the Polytechnic offered like liberal arts courses, which is quite unimaginable since. But, he scrapped it, Toh Chin Chai scrapped it, and really focused on what Singapore needed in terms of technical education. There was always a challenge, as we all know. Right? Technical education was enlarged by a number of reforms. There was also the formation of the Department of Technical Education in 1968 for a few years. But, in Singapore, we still have that focus on academic education. Although the polytechnics these days are becoming more popular in terms of what they offer. The thing with historical and memory aspects would be that not enough has been acknowledged of how technical education has contributed to Singapore's history, especially the people who were involved in technical education, and after technical education who went on to technical careers, to industrial careers rather than academic careers. So the book contains a few stories of some of these remarkable people in industry, in technical education training, in apprenticeship programs, in the marine industries, which shows that very much Singapore's industrialization was made possible people with expertise. And it's not just education or educational policy. It's not just what the reforms did, what the government did. Right? It is that these technical people were able to forge quite interesting careers. These careers will be very different from academic or professional careers, like a doctor or a lawyer.
Finally, which other kinds of local history would you consider using the theatres of memory concept on?
Yeah. So again, I should acknowledge Raphael Samuel for his book. And I think the key word in that phrase is actually not theatres. Theatres is the kind of eye-catching word. But theatres presume a place, right? But it doesn't have to be a place. It's more like a stage or a platform or a landscape. So the key word there is memory, that history should include memory as well as the things that we regard to be history. Right? Oftentimes, historians make a different distinction between history and memory. Right? History is based on the historical method based on mostly archival sources, whereas memory is seen to be something quite antithetical to it even, right? Like memory is not reliable. Memory is often corrected by the archives. Memory is often misleading, is biased. So I think what the great thing that Rafael Simon did was to break down this division and argue that actually memory is something that is very close to history and in fact makes history more democratic, richer, more aware of the different forces that were existing and influencing events in the past. The thing about memory is also that it has a element in the present. It's also rooted in the present. So theaters of memory is not just about academic inquiry. It's not just about what is of interest to historians. There are a very small group of scholars, but it's also what is of interest to the community, right? So if there's a community that's interested in old ships, for example, or if there's a community interested in, we had Bukit Brown cemeteries in Singapore, then the idea of theaters of memory can be applied to those topics as well. I would also say that things like schools, schools I think have been a neglected part of Singapore's memory, yet they often form a big part of our own memory and identity, isn't it? Especially the earlier schools, but also when we were children really, but also the older schools where we begin to gain a more adult identity. So this also includes the universities, of course, and the polytechnics. Making historical inquiry democratic also means that you should delve into more diverse sources, and this makes it imperative to diversify the concept of archives. So archives are no longer state documents or unpublished documents of organizations, but archives pretty much mean things such as oral history, which represents individual memory, but also sometimes the memory of communities, the historical collections, paraphernalia that be kept by communities that they believe represent their history. So for schools, for example, this would be things such as yearbooks. Of course, you have oral history of the people in the school, photographs of the schools. Yeah, I look forward to having more projects based on this concept of theaters of memory, but just basically just thinking that, our own histories and our own memories are valuable, they're important as part of the Singapore story, and that this is an endeavor that is not limited to just professional historians, but, pretty much open to community activists, organizers, residents, former employees themselves. So it's a big open project that I hope will take on in Singapore.